Black women's history is much more than the story of famous or celebrated black women. It also includes black women in our families, in our organizations, in our communities who made important impact on our own personal lives. Today I'd like to tell the story of such a black woman who's now an ancestor, Sister Una Mulzac, and we're getting started right now.
The greatest injustice is done to my people is done by the way of infection. Killing us slowly, erasing our history, done by the way of deception. God, do you know? God, do you know what you are? God, do you know what you are? Goddess, do you know? Goddess, do you know what you are?
Una Mulzac was born on April 19th, 1923, in Baltimore, and moved to the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, New York as a little girl. She graduated from Girls High School where she ran track and eventually got a secretarial job at Random House Publishing, where she became interested in the field of publishing. She then moved to Guyana, then known as British Guyana, in 1963 to join the revolutionary movement there. She joined the People's Progressive Party, or the PPP, an anti-colonial group pushing for Guyanese independence. Because of her experience in publishing, Una assumed the responsibility of operating the party's progressive bookstore. This was a risky move due to the hostility and violence between Una's People's Progressive Party and the U.S.-backed People's National Congress, or PNC. One day, in July of 1964, a customer left an unmarked package in the bookstore. When an employee tried to remove the package from the store, a bomb hidden inside exploded, killing him and another party member and bookstore employee. Mulzac, who was also in the bookstore, was severely injured, and she was subsequently hospitalized for weeks. She ultimately stayed in the country for 2 more years after recovering. But when the PNC took power in the newly independent Guyana in 1966, it denied Mulzac a visa to stay in the country. Mulzac then returned to New York City in the spring of 1967 and opened the legendary Liberation Bookstore in Harlem. It's important to understand that Una Mulzac did not develop her black revolutionary politics in a vacuum. She was heavily influenced by her father, Hugh Mulzac, who was the first black man to command a ship in the United States Merchant Marines. But more importantly, he was a member of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and he served as a captain on the SS Yarmouth, one of the ships of Marcus Garvey's Black Star shipping line. It's also important to understand, Sister Mulzac was not the first black person to open a black political bookstore in Harlem. Her bookstore was preceded by others, like the National Memorial African Bookstore founded in 1932 by Louis Michaud, and the Frederick Douglass Book Center established by Richard B. Moore. These black bookstores were much more than places just to purchase reading material. They were important community spaces where black revolutionaries, activists, community leaders met, received mentorship, and strategized. They were institutions that served as repositories of black political thought and practice. In fact, the FBI viewed these black bookstores in Harlem and throughout the country as serious political threats. In November of 1968, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo directing all such bookstores to be closely monitored. These black bookstore owners were not just business people. They were political activists and radical intellectuals themselves who were actively engaged in the struggle for black liberation. Sister Mulzac, for example, involved herself in a number of different activities, including tenant strikes and a number of protests against police brutality, the miseducation of black youth, and American imperialism. On a personal note, as a high school student, I became a frequent visitor to Liberation Bookstore, where I purchased books and received tutelage from Sister Una herself. She admired my love for Malcolm X, and I was drawn to her engaging and dynamic personality. When I later entered college and became a student leader, I made it a point to visit Liberation Bookstore during my college breaks. Sister Una took a keen interest in my growth as a community organizer and activist. and her face would light up whenever I updated her on my campus activism. When I was on campus, I mailed her copies of my organization's newsletter, The Black Voice, and she would call me to discuss the articles, encourage me, and offer suggestions and political insight. From 1974 to 2007, when it closed down, Liberation Bookstore was the leading Pan-African bookstore in Harlem. Declining health forced Una to close her doors, and she eventually died 5 years later on January 21st, 2012, at the age of 88 years old. Master teacher, community activist, and revolutionary entrepreneur, Una Mulzac provided an example we can all learn from and implement today. Love your people, stand up for your people, fight alongside your people, and teach your people. Mama Una, your energy and example are missed. Ashe. Black women's history is much